the Sounds True Podcast Network.
I've failed miserably at being with my own pain and the pain of others. I've failed miserably, but I've learned to come back, just to come back, just begin again. That in itself is the kindest, most extraordinary of meditation instructions, but it's also the way to work with the ways in which we've been abandoned either by ourselves or others.
In this episode of Insights at the Edge, I am so pleased and honored that our guest is Frank Ostaseski. Frank is a pioneer in compassionate end-of-life care and a respected Buddhist teacher. He co-founded the Zen Hospice Project, America's first Buddhist hospice, and established the Metta Institute to train healthcare professionals and caregivers. He's taught at Harvard Medical School and the Mayo Clinic, and he's the author of the book, The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. Friends, stay with us. Frank, welcome.
Welcome, thanks
friend.
a lot, Tami. Nice to be with you. And let me say, I want to begin by thanking you for your own wisdom, but also how you gather wisdom and share it with the world. So thank you for doing that. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. And this is the first time we've ever had the chance to have a conversation like this and record it, a podcast conversation. And if it's okay with you, I want to jump right to my sense of the heart of the matter, which is as I was familiarizing myself with your work, what I learned is that you've distilled into these 2 questions what's most alive for people as they face the end of their life. The question, not so much, the regrets of the dying, this or that. No, that's not what you have distilled down to this core. It's, am I loved? And have I loved well? And this was really meaningful to me. I started reflecting on these 2 questions deeply. And I thought, well, when it comes to loving well, I think I could do a lot more. And I have some ideas about that. And I want to know more about what you know about that. But then when I thought, am I loved? I thought, that's a lot more mysterious. I don't know. What can I even do about that? So that's where I want to start. I want to hear from you, your insights on these 2 questions that are on our hearts when we face dying.
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, let me just say that's a kind of paraphrasing of what I've learned from being with people. And they're not evaluative. They aren't, did I do well? Did I pass the test? But what's my experience? Am I loved? How do I even ascertain that? As you know, we worked with a lot of people had been living on the streets, folks who, had complex lives, let's say, really complex lives. And often they came to us and they were just glad to be warm, dry, and inside, And so then they came into this environment at Zen Hospice where they discovered a certain kind of kindness that they maybe didn't know in their lives. And so this question really came up for them. Am I loved? I feel loved by you guys. I don't know if I was loved before this. I feel loved by you guys, meaning the Zen Hospice volunteers. So yeah, am I loved? Am I loved? Did I love well? Again, not evaluative, but I know my grandchildren love me. I know I've learned to love myself over the years. And I've done my very best to express that love. In my case, mostly through service, through trying to be of some use and value to people, to this world. So those are just my first impressions in response to your question. Do you feel loved? How about you?
I think it's an arena that I want to grow in. And I think some of it requires an increase in receptivity, but also, and I'd love to hear more what you have to say about this as well, what I notice is that when I focus on loving others, there's like this interesting reciprocity. I suddenly feel more loved too, because they mirror it back immediately. It's just, it's like you give it and it comes right back. It's interesting.
I don't know, a couple of years ago, I was in Mexico City for a holiday with a dear friend of mine. And the very first night, we were walking through the big, plaza there in Mexico City. And I stepped off a very high curb, fell to the ground, and met some very hard concrete. And I broke my femur. And I couldn't move. And I was laying there in the rain in the street for almost 2 hours, waiting for an ambulance to come. And what was extraordinary was the people who came around me, people who were just walking through the plaza I didn't know. One, of course, everybody wanted to help me stand up. I knew I shouldn't do that. So one placed a piece of cardboard under my head. Another took her shawl off and wrapped it over me, This was really moved me. It really moved me. Later, I was in the hospital, and I don't like hospitals. I don't trust them, honestly. And I get scared, and I feel helpless. And I called a buddy of mine, her, Joan Halifax, Roshi Joan Halifax, and she had just come from being with His Holiness. And I said, "What'd you learn?" And he said, she said that he was teaching that altruism is the balancing factor for helplessness. And I really got it. It landed for me. And so from that moment, I just started practicing altruism when everybody was taking care of me. And not just saying thank you to them, but receiving their care. And it has something to do with what you were just saying, this receptivity that we have. So, some home health aide who maybe had 2 weeks of training and probably made a couple of dollars an hour. I said to her, I'm so glad for your training because you're positioning me in bed and now I can rest. I'll be able to sleep tonight. And she got very proud and happy. But what I realized that it wasn't just about saying thank you. It was about receiving someone's care, receiving somebody's love. Yeah. So I don't know. This is a never-ending exploration for me, Tami, actually.
I'm curious, though, because you train and have historically trained caregivers, how this notion of helping people feel loved infuses the attitude and the behaviors of a caregiver, potentially. What kind of training helps people with that?
I think learning to touch their own suffering with some degree of kindness, getting to know their own what's difficult for them, their own losses, their own fears, etc. And that enables them to build an empathetic bridge to the person that they're caring for. And then that individual feels met, and their heart opens. And, we don't have to teach them how to get out of that situation. We have to meet them there. Yeah, we have to meet them empathetically in that moment. And we can only do that if we've done our homework. If we haven't, we're just guessing. Yeah.
Now, you yourself have been meeting your own difficult territory. I was reading in preparation for this conversation that you had a heart attack several years ago and said you found yourself on the other side of the sheets, so to speak. And just before and preparing for our conversation together, you and I in discussion, you mentioned that you've had some strokes as well over the last few years. And I'm curious how those experiences have perhaps furthered your understanding of what's really needed in these kinds of situations now that you've been on the other side of the sheets. When I had heart challenges, I had a triple bypass surgery, a big deal. They cut you open and spread you like a crab. And when I came to the recovery unit, if you will, after the surgery, a dear friend of mine who's a meditation teacher was with me, and I couldn't breathe well. I was still intubated. And a respiratory therapist came into the room and said, "Let's take out those tubes and see if you can breathe."
Literally, that's what he said. And I had a piece of paper and I wrote to my friend, I'm scared. I'm really scared. And he said, follow your breath. Well, I couldn't follow my breath because I was intubated. Then he said, sense your body, sense your feet. I couldn't sense my feet because still, anesthesia was still running through my body. So I grabbed him, actually, and I pulled him close to me, Tami, and I just put my ear on his cheek so I could listen to his breathing rhythm. And as he would breathe, I would stabilize, I could stabilize my fear in a way. So I think being able to meet fear, our own, but also not giving more fear to people as they find themselves in these scary situations is really important. A very famous Tibetan teacher called me after my heart attacks. I won't say his name, but I knew he'd had a heart attack. And so I thought, oh, he'll know, right? He'll know what to do. He'll know how to deal with the depression and the fear and the beauty that was part of that experience. And so I asked him, what do you do, and how do you do it? And I thought he'd give me some practice or some esoteric teaching of some kind. And, there was a pause on the phone. And then he said, well, I think it's good to have a heart. And if you have a heart, you should expect that we'll have problems. And then he paused for a moment, then he hung up. That was it. No esoteric teaching, no great new practice, just that. And afterwards, I thought, he's right. If we have a heart, if we have a human life, we should expect that we'll have problems. Who told us otherwise? So meeting this in myself, meeting this in other people, I think this is the way that, we begin to understand something about our innate vulnerability, which of course isn't just weakness, is for me one of the most beautiful of our human qualities because it allows the beauty and horror of the world to impress itself on our souls. And honestly, that's a lot of what happens for me when I'm with people at the end of life. I just hang out with them. I don't have any solutions. And I just try to be real. And that includes my extending to them my own kindness and how I've experienced something like what they're experiencing. Yeah.
There's a couple things about that story that really impress me, Frank. One of them is that here you are, you're this very highly regarded Buddhist teacher, and you write on the little pad of paper, I'm afraid. Yeah. And I think we have some notion that, when we become quote unquote, deep spiritual practitioners or something like that, we'll be sitting up in full lotus at the time of our death and gracefully eject through the top of our head. We have like fantasies. And of course, and we're not going to be afraid.
Tami, there's a beautiful story of Suzuki Roshi, shortly before he died. There's beautiful stories of his great, alertness and awakening. But on this one, his Oka-san, his wife, wanted him to take a bath. And so his son helped him into the bathtub, and his son lowered him into the bathtub very slowly. This is a day or two before he's dying. And Suzuki Roshi got scared. Suzuki Roshi couldn't swim, and he was a little afraid of water. And as his son was dropping him into the water, he got scared. And his son said, "Father, find your breath." He couldn't. He was scared. And I thought, God, if Suzuki Roshi can be scared, I can be scared. It's just human. And I don't think our practice eliminates fear. I think it gives us a capacity to work with it. I don't think it protects us from anything. At least this has been my experience. It gives me the capacity to work with what's difficult.
How would you say your practice gave you the capacity to work with the fear you felt?
Well, first, it gives me the ability to acknowledge it. It's here. It's here. And knowing that it's here, now what? What can I meet it with? What's the attitude of mind that I might be able to discover that would be helpful? I'm not, I'm not so interested in getting rid of anything anymore. I'm not interested in getting rid of my fear. I don't think it's so possible, honestly. But I'm interested in knowing what the attitude of mine is in relationship to it and how that might support me in those moments.
All right, so let's talk more about fears that people have about their own death. In your work, I've heard you identify and talk about 3 fears, and I want to talk about the third, but then I want to bring forth a fourth, if that's okay.
Great.
But the first one is, I'm afraid of the pain, and you write and speak to the fact that medication, of course, can be extraordinarily helpful, and like double thumbs up, we can use medication effectively at the time of our dying and entering closer to that time. I'm going to be emotionally abandoned. That's the second one. And here in your story, which is another point, when you were being taken off the breathing tube, when your friend leaned in, what a beautiful gesture of you weren't emotionally abandoned. He was right there for you.
Yeah.
And I want to stop here for a moment and talk about other ways we can help people who are getting close to the dying process or in the dying process not feel emotionally abandoned.
Yeah, or support them when they do feel it.
Better said. Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, I mean, Tami, isn't that the most natural thing for us to do? I mean, yes, of course, we want to reach in and we want to fix it and et cetera. But, what do you do when you're with a friend and they're scared? What do you do when you're with someone who...
Tell them to buck up. No, I'm just kidding, Frank.
Yeah. That's not an uncommon response in our culture. Buck up, get it together. I'm not afraid of people falling apart. I'm not afraid of Pandora's box. A way I speak about this is that I've got a lot of tools, right? Things I've developed over the years, all kinds of skill sets, let's call them. But I don't lead with those. When I go into a room where someone's dying, I lead with my humanity. So I bring my own fear into the room. I bring my own, emotional abandonment into the room. It doesn't mean I ask the patient to be my therapist, and we're not talking all about my stuff. But I can bring what I've learned from those experiences into the room. I have some sense of what it feels like. So I can meet them again in this empathetic way. When people feel emotionally abandoned, just love them. That's what's helped me. Just love them until they can love themselves again.
Now, Frank, you mentioned that when you work with caregivers, you encourage, inspire, point them into doing their homework, their own inner work around whatever their fears may be that they might be bringing and clouding the situation with. And here you said, I'm not afraid of my own Pandora's box. And I thought to myself, I wonder what Frank has been through himself, inside himself, such that, there's this sense of like, whatever it is, I can face or meet it, or at least I'm willing to, or there's an openness to something like that.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got their share of pain and suffering, right? I don't know that mine is any so special in a way. And I've failed miserably at being with my own pain and the pain of others. I failed miserably. But I've learned to come back, just to come back. That's the thing that has been most helpful. Just begin again. Yeah. That in itself is the kindest, most extraordinary of meditation instructions, but it's also the way to work with you know, the ways in which we've been abandoned either by ourselves or others. You know, when I was a teenager, not unlike a lot of people, I went through a very bad sexual abuse situation, right? I don't think mine was any worse than anyone else's who have been through those kinds of experiences, but I felt really alone in it, terribly alone. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't get the support that a young boy would have benefited from. But I remember it was by a priest. And I remember outside the rectory where this priest lived, there was this big willow tree. I just thought of this now, Tami, and I would leave this situation where there'd been this abuse, and I would go out and I'd sit under this willow tree, this weeping willow, literally, and I'd put my back against it. And I just felt the support of this big tree, you know, and because of its name, I would just cry. I remember I just would be under this tree weeping, under the weeping willow weeping. And I felt the support of this tree. I didn't feel the support of any human beings, but I felt that support. And I think, well, in my life, I've been fortunate. There's always something that can support me. Oh, there's always something. And so I've learned to trust that. I've had lots of things. I don't want to go on about my illnesses, but I've had, as you said, several strokes. And one of the last times I was sitting at my computer typing something, and everything got pixelated. The screen, the walls, everything. And I called my wife at the time and said, I think I'm having another stroke. And she called 911, and we waited for them to come. I live on a houseboat, so we have to walk down this long dock to the parking lot where the ambulance would be. And so they would come with a gurney, and my wife encouraged me to sit still. But I said, I want to walk. I just want to walk down the dock. I want to feel my feet. And she said, you stupid old man. But I walked. And as I walked down the dock, I felt very unstable. I had to hang on to the railing and to her. But internally, I felt very stable, not because I was doing anything. You know, I wasn't doing some special Buddhist practice. There was just something there. And there was a great deal of love. And I don't know where it came from, or even why it came at that moment, but my whole being felt this. And we stopped about halfway down the dock, and I looked over the railing, and then everything dissolved. Everything. All went away. Frank went away, the dock went away, it all went away. And there was just this absolute absence. Awareness, but no qualities in that awareness. Just absence. Anyway, she tugged me, and we went on down to the ambulance, and I had a grand mal seizure as they were putting me into the ambulance. They gave me some medication. They took me to the hospital. This was at the beginning of COVID, so no one could come in the hospital with me. And it turned out that the medication they were giving me, I had it had side effects. And one of those side effects was paranoia. And I'd never been paranoid in my life. I've been with lots of paranoid people, but never. And for a while, I was in this hospital unit, and I didn't know where I was. And the only thing I could do, I didn't even feel comfortable telling the healthcare professionals that I was paranoid. So the only thing I kept doing was I just kept repeating this phrase, right now it's like this. Right now it's like this. And I did it for 2 days, Tami, until finally something stabilized. And this paranoia diminished. Right now it's like this. Right now it's like this. And that was, for me, in my own experience, really helpful.
Thank you for sharing that story, Frank. And I'm going to track back to a moment in it that is important to me, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Which is, you're talking about how you're walking down the dock, and you have the railing and your wife on one side, and you felt this love atmosphere.
Yeah.
And when I was saying to you at the beginning of our conversation, I know I can do more to love people, but what about being loved? I actually did think of this, I don't know how else to call it, but this essential quality that always is there, that is love, that is our nature. And I thought, well, I just need, keep deepening in that, keep deepening that, keep knowing it, spend more time in it. So what I want to ask you is, I want to know what it felt like. Like, help me be there with you in some way, if you could give language to it.
Yeah. Well, you're right. And thank you for helping us all to recognize that it's an innate quality in us, that it's not just a byproduct. It's one of our most essential qualities. And of course we can cultivate it. Of course we can do various practices that help us with that. We can choose to lean into it at other points in our life. But then it's just reliable. And it felt as if every cell in my body was filled with this. And I suspect now that it was just a natural reaction to fear that have cultivated over time. That when I've been afraid, that quality is something I turn toward. The quality of love is something I turn toward. And it's stable. It's really stable. When I came home from the hospital after these strokes, the caregivers, the professionals were very worried that I lived on a boat because I just had a stroke and, they thought for sure I would fall down. And so I was very careful when I came home. And I would stand at the top of the stairs to go down to my bedroom. And they were daunting. If I fell, I knew I would not only hurt myself, but I would hurt a lot of other people, and particularly my son, who I love beyond words. And so I'd stand at the top of the stairs and I would imagine my son at the bottom of the stairs. And I would think about how much I love him and how much it would hurt him if I fell. And that love, Tami, was so strong and stabilizing, more stable than the handrail taking me down the stairs. It was so real. It wasn't just an imagined experience. It was a stable quality in me that could enable me to meet this very practical situation of walking down a flight of stairs. We can do this. And we can do this not only for ourselves, we can do this for one another. Sometimes we get lost and we can't find this love that we're speaking of here. We just get lost. And then it's really helpful if there's someone like you are doing for me, remind me of it. And sometimes that's all it's required. It's just a reminder. You're asking me to tell the story, but you're also helping me to see that this lives in me. So thank you for that.
And I think part of the reason I wanted to go into it is that I think the more we can show it, the more I've been shown it by people. It's a type of, and I'm going to use a technical Tibetan Buddhist term, and I don't mean this in a technical way, just in an everyday way. It's a type of pointing out of something that's always present that we're ignoring. And so I want to receive that pointing out as much as I can. Now, Frank, something, I realize as we're talking, I kind of went very quickly. Okay, there are 4 big fears. The first is pain. Well, okay, we're going to take a bunch of medicine. That's going to be fine. And I realized that I skipped over that kind of quickly, that someone might be listening and thinking to themselves, wait, hold on. The pain is the physical pain of dying is the biggest fear I have. Before you, Tami, get into all your existential questions and stuff, let's not skip over the physical pain of dying. And what is Frank's view as someone who has been at the bedside of so many people about upping the medication to the point where I'm not in pain anymore? Is that okay? Or have I become like stupid in dying and that's not okay?
I don't know. I don't think it's so helpful to leave people so merciful to leave people in unrelenting pain. I mean, I joke that we used to have, morphine by the 50-gallon drums at Zen Hospice, I think it's really essential. The concern that those people who are in the spiritual world, let's call it, have is that, I will become unconscious, or I will become, unable to stay present in some way. I don't know that I agree with that. I think we can probably manage about 90% of people's physical pain, and sometimes people will get confused, no question about it. Joan Halifax was with His Holiness, and she asked him this very same question you just asked me. And she said, what should we do in this situation? And His Holiness paused for a moment, and then he had a really good answer. He said, mercy. It was a beautiful response, a simple one-word answer, mercy, mercy. And then he went on to speak about there's a level of mind stream that's not affected by this and that we can access as well. But for the general public, let's call it, the regular folks, I think to manage people's pain is a merciful act. And my experience has been, even when people are affected by the side effects of that medication, it's very possible to meet them, and it's still very possible to communicate with them. So I'm all for using managing people's symptoms and controlling their pain.
Okay, I want to keep going down this mercy track for a moment, and then we're going to get back, don't worry, to fear number 3 and my surprise fear number 4, which is one of the questions I've heard from some of my spiritual practitioner friends has to do with taking our own life if we're in an extraordinary amount of pain and suffering, and are we cutting short some type of evolutionary process, growth process that would happen if we didn't do that, and the debate around that. And so I've known several people, and I'm sure many of us have, who have decided that some version of taking their own life, medically assisted help in dying, was the way to go, and then people around them second guessing it. And I'm wondering what your view is of that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's a lot of ways to die. And physician-assisted death or medical aid in dying, this is just another way to die. I'm a little allergic to the idea of a good death, to be honest with you. That term worries me.
Mm-hmm.
Because, it's hard enough to die. It's really hard work to die. It's the hardest work we may ever do. And someone else imposing their agenda on how we should do that doesn't feel merciful. It just makes things harder. Yeah. So, I remember being with a very well-known Zen teacher, and he was in a lot of pain, and all his students around him were like, no, we can't give him pain medication. I said, please give him pain medication. He did, he relaxed, and then he was able to work with the other symptoms that he had. No, I don't think it cuts anything short. I think it's a merciful act. And people may make that choice. Often I think what happens now and what happens in the time of dying may be very different for us. We like having choice now. We like having agency. So I'm glad that medical aid in dying exists. It takes away people's fear. It gives them some sense of agency or control now. But what happens in the dying process might be very different. We're reconstituted by the dying process. And I don't want to impose any agenda on someone else's dying.
Can you tell me what you mean we're reconstituted in the dying process?
All of the ways we've defined ourselves, Tami, I'm a Buddhist teacher, you're hosting this conversation. All the various roles that we've carried in our life, they're either gracefully given up in the dying process or they are stripped away in the dying process. And when our sense of identity is stripped away, our sense of small self, let's call it, is stripped away, for the average person, it's terrifying. I don't know who I am, And, those famous 5 stages that Elizabeth had, Kubler-Ross had, about grief that got glommed onto the dying process. And the last of which was acceptance, if you remember. And hospice workers can sometimes be overzealous about getting people to acceptance. I don't think acceptance is a final stage. I think it's the beginning. It's still a choice. It's still me making the choice to accept. I think as this process that I just described occurs, there can be a kind of chaos. And this chaos often gives way to something infinitely deeper than acceptance, which is surrender. And personally, I'm not so sure we can choose to surrender. I think lots of things can contribute to it: religious practice, conviction, faith, etc. But I think also exhaustion can.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I've seen more than anything, is people just can't keep up the fight anymore. And it happens to people who are dying, and it happens to people who are doing long meditation retreats. Surrender happens. And then that opens the door to something far deeper, a kind of possibility for transformation. When we let go of something, there's this feeling of that we're distancing ourselves from something. We're putting something down, right? That's a choice. Surrender is different. It doesn't feel that way to me. It doesn't feel like I'm distancing myself. It feels like I'm actually coming closer to something that I fundamentally know. And it feels more like expansion than distancing myself from anything. And I watched this with regular people who had no spiritual practice, no so-called inner life, But the dying process there are conditions in the dying process that help them to discover that. It helped them to see that they were more than the small separate self they've taken themselves to be. And that was phenomenal to see. Regularly I saw it, not just once in a while. I regularly saw it in people.
And Frank, this is the third of the big fears that you say most of us have, that all my identities will either be stripped away or gracefully given up.
Yeah.
And, this, I think, is actually something that a lot of us can relate to as a kind of metaphoric practice, or we get a practice session in our life. We get a practice session in our life if there's some big identity shift, like a divorce or a life-defining loss of some kind. And, I went through something like this recently. And so when you say, not a divorce, but a life-defining loss for me. And what I noticed is, as much as people around me were like, be a spiritual practitioner and just let go, I was just like, F you, leave me alone. I'm in a process, and I need to go through this process, that it involves honoring and acknowledging a lot of what I'm letting go of. And it's just not going to be that simple. But at a certain point, and I do think it was a kind of exhaustion point, or just like my face had been in the dust of the ground for so long that I just finally heaved and said, okay, reality's bigger than me. I'm going to go with this. And I would love to hear from you and your own experience, if you would be willing to share, or if you would rather a story of someone that you've worked with, that surrender moment.
Well, first of all, I just want to compliment you on the way in which you responded to people who wanted you to be the spiritual practitioner in the midst of your loss. Yeah.
They thought I was difficult and perhaps not as evolved as I had, whatever they thought I was, but I didn't care. I knew it was my integrity. So.
Yeah, good for you. And, this happens a lot, right? We have these maps about how we're supposed to go through these experiences, and we overlay them onto the direct experience. And I think we do harm to people when we do that. I think we do them great harm, So I really applaud you for staying with what was real for you. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a story. There's always a story in my life, I
want to hear it. Tell me a story, Frank.
All right. So one of the places where Zen Hospice serves is at a big hospital called Laguna Honda Hospital. It's a long-term care facility. It's got 1,100 beds. It's when you're poor and you don't have any insurance, it's where you wind up in San Francisco. And it's an old-style hospital with these big wards that were 30 people to a ward. Bed after bed after bed, like a gauntlet of beds. And one day I'm walking down this gauntlet of beds, going to a meeting, and there's this guy, and he gets my attention, and I stop. I don't go to my meeting. I go and sit next to him, and he's an older African-American man, and he's struggling. I think he's actively dying. He's sweating. He's breathing with great difficulty. He's confused. He's all over the place. And I sat down next to him, and I said, "Hey, you look like you're working really hard." And then he pointed toward the sky with his finger, and he said, "I just got to get there." And I said, okay. Can I come along if I promise to keep up? This is how I work with people. And he nodded his head, and he grabbed my hand. And I said, "I forgot my glasses. I can't see very far into the distance. Can you see?" And he described a kind of rising to a kind of plateau, And so we walked up this hill to this plateau. He was huffing and puffing. It was hard. And we clearly had reached this top of this hill. And I said, "Can you see there further into the distance?" And he said, "Yeah." And he described for me this building, which was a one-room red schoolhouse. Yeah. He probably went to school. He came out of Mississippi. He probably went to a schoolhouse like this when he was a kid. So I said, "You want to go?" "Yeah." We walk up to this schoolhouse. I said, "There's the door. You want to go in?" "Yeah." I said, "Can I go with you?" "No." I said, "Okay, then you go." And he went up the 3 steps to the schoolhouse. He described it to me. He went in the door, and then he died. I think this was a moment where he was understanding something. I mean, not metaphysically understanding something. He was just going to his idea of something that was familiar and real, that was transformative for him, that involved new learning for him. I mean, we could make up all kinds of things about it afterwards, but he just found home. And I think that's what happens in this surrender, in this transformation. It's not so much that we have some big spiritual opening. It's that we come home. We come home to ourselves, to ourselves, to the fundamental self you were speaking of earlier when we were talking about love. That's as much of a truth. That's a way in which surrender can occur. It's a way I've witnessed it occur. And that might happen, in the final weeks of life, or the final days of life, or the final moments of life, like it did for him. And we might say too late, and I would agree. Feels too late. Let's not wait until that moment to discover what's meaningful to us.
Which is my next question, which is, this whole notion of practicing dying, dying as a spiritual practice. We can do this in our life. So at the moment of our death, it's easier for us to surrender. It's a well-worn pathway. What would you suggest? Like, how do we have our integrity when we're fighting a situation? But hey, wait, this is the time. Practice dying.
Yeah. Well, as you well know, in the Buddhist tradition, there is an importance about the moment of death. It's considered a great moment. It has conditions that are conducive to our awakening. And I was in a retreat with a well-known Buddhist teacher who you know, and he was sharing this with the retreatants. And I went up to him afterwards. I said, I love you and I have a deep respect for you, but please stop telling people that. And he was like, what? But it says it in the suttas. I said, yeah, I know, but it just leaves people feeling guilty when they don't get to do it. When their mother was on morphine and she wasn't able to be clear in that moment. Just let people die the way they die, and let's not sit in judgment of it. So how do we do that in our day-to-day life? I'm a spiritual pragmatist, Here's what I do. watch endings. Watch the way in which you meet endings. Yes, the ending of the breath, the ending of the exhale, all those things we learn in practice, but also the end of a meal or the end of a conversation or the way you leave a, conference. How do you meet endings? Where did you learn to meet them that way? Are you satisfied with meeting endings in that way? Do you want to change it in any way? I think that helps us. We want to know what happens, how we meet the moment of dying. It has a lot to do with our habits of the way in which we meet endings. Do you say goodbye to the, people you were just in this conference with? When I was at the hospice, I made a point of going around and saying goodbye to everybody in the hospice before I went home for the night because I didn't know if I'd see them in the morning. So I watch endings. Yeah.
That's a really terrific instruction. I'm reminded of a conference that I was at recently, and when it came time to end, I just felt so overwhelmed, and I was there with my partner, and she was like, "Wow, you're hello, are you there?" She's like, "Let's go over and sit over here by ourselves so that you can kind of collect yourself." And we didn't say goodbye to most of the people who were there, but yet I didn't feel I also was present enough to do that. So I can see how watching endings is very helpful and instructive. I'm curious, besides the example you gave of saying goodbye to everybody in the hospice when you left, what have you learned about how you want to handle the everyday endings in your life? How are you doing it now?
First of all, I might reflect back to you that you took extraordinary care of yourself. And that's how you met the ending of this. You took extraordinary care of yourself. And yes, maybe you didn't get a chance to say goodbye to everybody, all those things that we might like to do, but you took care of yourself. And I applaud you for doing that. That's a beautiful lesson you learned about how to meet endings. So thank you for sharing that example with me. Yeah. I teach in Italy a lot. You would never think about leaving a gathering in someone's house without saying goodbye. Here we ghost people all the time. We're ready to leave the party, we leave. We end relationships on Post-its, for goodness sakes, in our culture. So how do I meet endings?
What have you learned about that so that you're more congruent within yourself around it, or whatever you aspire to in relationship to endings?
Yeah. After I had one of those strokes, Ram Dass called me. He said, "What'd you see? What'd you see? Anything?" And I said, "Oh, I was a total failure. I didn't see anything, He said, "Me too. When it happened for me, all I saw was the pipes as they were rolling me down the hole in the gurney." I don't imagine I have endless time. When we hold the truth of our ultimate ending, our dying, I'm not even sure that's the ultimate ending, but when we hold the truth of dying in our hands, I think that we let go a little more easily. I think we're more kind to one another. I think when we recognize that this is our common ground, we can be, these things come forward. We don't take ourselves so seriously. We don't hold on to our ideas with such a tight grasp. And so this is what I notice in my life, is that I don't hold on quite so tightly anymore. We're so driven by our expectations about how it should go and how things should turn out, and we're outcome driven. Yeah. And so I'm more interested in the transitions. I'm interested in not just when I get to that person's house, but how I get to that person's house. What's the walk like or the drive like? I'm more interested in transitions these days than I am in outcomes. So endings are all about that. They're all about not just that moment at the end of our lives or at the end of the breath, but everything that gets us there.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I have promised this quote unquote cliffhanger, which is a bit of a pun. Big fears around dying. here's the fourth one I want to bring forward. The fear of non-existence. The big fat zero, but nothing, absolutely nothing. And it's interesting when you were describing your mini stroke experience after the love, you used the word absence.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I've gone through a process, and I could share just very briefly about it, about non-existence, because I've had to work this out, because that was my big fear.
Yeah. Yeah. You know better than I probably, Tami. And, when you look into anything closely enough, right? Put something under an electron microscope, you look into any solid thing, you see a lot of space. You see a lot of emptiness. Look into emptiness long enough, you see form coming out of it. So that's, basic Buddhist teaching, right? But this experience I described to you of looking over in this absence, what was interesting about it is it didn't have any qualities. It didn't have some loving quality. It didn't have compassion. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't strength. None of those essential qualities were present in that moment. It was just absent. And what I understood, at least for myself, was that's the ground from which everything emerges. And instead of it being frightening, it gave me great confidence, actually, that I could know this. Yeah, that I could know it. I'm just reflecting for myself on imagining that at the time of our dying, we're going to have the physical strength, the emotional stability, the mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime is an absurd gamble. And to wait for that moment is foolish. Yeah. So I want to know those other moments. And it may be that I do particular practices that engender them, but we have moments like this all the time. It wasn't just because of having a stroke. We have moments where we touch something real and essential that's empty, that's without form. And I think it's important that we turn toward those moments and watch their impact on the rest of our lives.
Part of what you said that was powerful was that the experience that you had of being in this absence, or as this absence, whatever words you want to use, gave you confidence.
Yeah.
Gave you a kind of confidence. And is it fair to say it gave you more, I'm going to put words in your mouth now, but tell me if it's not true, more confidence in dying?
Yeah, and living and dying. I shared these experiences that I shared with you with a teacher of mine. And I said, suppose that was the moment of my dying. I felt all this love, then I felt this absence, and then there was this paranoia, And I said, suppose that was the moment of my dying. He said to me, that would be okay. What do you mean it would be okay? And he said, well, when you died, your brain would stop and the paranoia would go away and awareness would return. It doesn't surprise me that you had this love as you were walking down the dock. You've been cultivating it all your life. And then when you stopped, you could see, you felt this absence, is what he called absolute absence. Yeah. I hadn't heard that term before, but I knew the experience. And so at first I thought, oh, this is a spiritual bypass. What's he telling me? But then I felt he was right. I felt confidence. And yeah, I have more confidence, kind of faith, we could say. Not only in the dying process, but how my life will prepare me for it,
Frank, one thing I want to pull out a little more about, because it's a powerful statement and I've never heard anybody else say it, when you said, I'm allergic at this point to the notion of quote unquote a good death. Because I think this notion of a good death is something that I've heard a lot in spiritual circles. This is sort of the fruition of all this work we're doing, is a good death. And here's Frank Ostaseski, the one who has sat at the bedside of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I don't know how many hundreds of people, and trained hundreds of people to do so, who's saying he's allergic to the notion of a good death. So I want to make sure we're clear about why that's so.
Well, what concerns me is the imposition of, if you ask me what's my great fear when dying, it's that somebody will come and impose their ideas on my dying. That they'll have some idea about how I should do it, and they'll start taking actions that will, based on their belief. One of the things that I think about is, how do we deal with our own dying or the grief and loss of others? How do we move toward the light of absolute truth and still accept and honor our very human nature? And I don't think it's by suppressing our grief, for example, or, by attempting some spiritual bypass around it or around our dying process. As you said earlier, your friends tell you to let go, but, Stephen Levine, who was a dear friend of mine and teacher for a while, he said, there's no letting go until there's letting in, right? So I think a wiser, more compassionate approach is to trust the process of dying, to trust the process of grieving as a process that brings us, or a path, we could say, that brings us to a greater wholeness. There's a long description around the Buddha's death. And, there are venerable monks around, and then who are sitting in great serenity. And then there is other monks who are rolling around on the ground and tearing their hair out. And I always was drawn to this particular image. And I would like to have been one of the monks who would be sitting in serenity. But I think more likely, if someone I loved died, I would be one of the monks rolling around on the ground and tearing my hair out. I might be swept away by this loss, this anguish. And in that story, there are venerable monks who are, telling the others that, the Blessed One told us that this is how it is, that everything that is born comes to death. But I don't think I would have found it very helpful. Maybe like your friends, It would have been more helpful to me if there was somebody sitting beside me who wasn't trying to give me advice, who was just there, and could listen or not impose something on me.
Frank, first of all, I want to thank you for the trueness, the honesty of our conversation. I've heard you say that one thing that happens when you're sitting at the bedside of people is it increases that quality of honesty in the space. No bullshit here. And as we conclude our conversation, I want to ask you, as you look at however many years you have left, is there anything in your heart that's like, okay, this is what I want to say. This is what matters most. No, it's not like some bucket list, and it's not, I'm not doing longevity practices or whatever. What is it that is actually alive there for you at this point?
Oh, gosh, this may not sound terribly deep or spiritual, but in a way, I just want to be a kind old uncle, to people in this life. I have more interest in my life in just allowing people to be just as they are, and allowing myself to be just as we are. And this is the heart of my practice these days, my Dharma practice and my going through life practice. Learn to allow things to be just as they are, without running in the other direction from them or trying to change everything around. I'm scared of dying, Tami. I get scared of these things that we've been talking about. Of course I do. But the fear isn't the only thing in the room. So I want to practice with what else is in the room here besides that fear, in addition to that fear. And how can that enable me to be with these things that we've been talking about that scare the hell out of us? Whatever we can give space to can move, can change. And so these days I spend a lot of much of my time working with that. How can I be kind? How can I allow there to be some degree of space with whatever contraction is happening for me in that moment? I don't know what the hell happens when we die. Some people claim they do. Maybe they do. I don't know. I got enough that I'm facing here in this life, And so these days, that's what interests me. The two wings, as the Buddha talked about, the wings of wisdom and compassion. That's a more extraordinary way to talk about it. But all I know is that my efforts to cultivate wisdom without compassion, it gets kind of cold and heady. And my idea is to cultivate compassion without any wisdom. Well, they get a little mushy and sentimental. So I want those two dimensions of my life as much as possible to interweave with each other, And I'm not so interested in transcendence anymore. I'm interested in being right here, right now. And hopefully that's what will influence my process of dying. But if it doesn't, it's okay.
Frank Ostaseski, author of The 5 Invitations, Discovering What Death Can Teach Us About Living Fully. You have been a kind and wise old uncle, older brother to me right here in this conversation. I feel so connected and seen and uplifted by you and the warm heart that you've brought. Thank you so much, and many, many blessings.
Thank you for the conversation, a real conversation.
Thanks, friends. Thanks for being with us. And if you'd like to watch Insights at the Edge on video and participate in the after-show Q&A session with our guests, come join us on Sounds True 1, a new membership community featuring award-winning original shows, live classes, community learning, guided meditations, and more with the leading wisdom teachers of our time. Use promo code PODCAST to get your first month free. You can learn more at join.soundstrue.com. Sounds True, waking up the world. The Sounds True Podcast Network.